Hi there, everyone. My name is Richard Preiss. I'm an associate professor in the Department of English at the University of Utah, where I teach courses on Shakespeare, early modern drama, and Renaissance literature. And while we're in quarantine, I've been growing this rather silly mustache, which I hope doesn't prove distracting. This week, the National Theatre's NT at Home program airs its 2018 production of Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, directed by Simon Godwin. And as part of its partnership with NT Live, the Tanner Humanities Center has asked me to record a brief introduction to the play. Antony and Cleopatra was first printed in Shakespeare's Comedies, Histories, and Tragedies, today more commonly called his First Folio, in 1623, 7 years after his death. This means we can't be absolutely sure when it was written, but circumstantial evidence gives us a good idea. Shakespeare's main source was Plutarch's Lives of the Noble Grecians and Romans, a standard classical biography of Mark Antony that was available either in Latin or in an English translation. Cleopatra, meanwhile, had been the subject of many dramatic treatments throughout the 16th century. In particular, Samuel Daniels' 1594 play Cleopatra seems to have influenced Shakespeare's imagination. Daniels' play was revised in 1599 and then revised again in 1607, this time apparently in response to Shakespeare's play, whose influence it now incorporated in turn. This allows us to date the play pretty confidently to 1607, relatively late in Shakespeare's career. It's the tail end of a period overwhelmingly defined by his major tragedies: Hamlet, Othello, Macbeth, King Lear, the ones that go by only one name. And right before a seemingly new final phase, the sentimental, magical tragicomedies or romances of Pericles, Cymbeline, The Tempest, and The Winter's Tale. There are many categories within the Shakespeare canon into which we might usefully put Antony and Cleopatra. For example, Roman plays like Titus Andronicus or Coriolanus, or plays with two titular protagonists rather than one, like Romeo and Juliet or Troilus and Cressida. But it makes sense to think of this messy, gorgeous, misfit play as self-consciously transitional and experimental, as something in between, and maybe a study in hybridity itself. The historical moment it spans represented for Shakespeare's audiences perhaps the most fateful in-between period of all time. The few short years between the fall of the Roman Republic and its reconsolidation under a hereditary succession of Caesars into an empire. The play begins in the aftermath of Julius Caesar's assassination, and in some ways forms a belated sequel to the play Shakespeare himself had written on that subject some 8 years prior. Most of us, though, will need a refresher on the characters' conflicts and relationships, so here's a brief one. After defeating the Roman consul Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, aka Pompey the Great, Julius Caesar became dictator and, relevant for our purposes, visited Egypt, where he had an affair with Queen Cleopatra and fathered a son, Caesarion. In 44 BC, Caesar was stabbed to death by a conspiracy of Roman senators. During the ensuing civil war, the forces of his chief assassins, Brutus and Cassius, were defeated at the Battle of Philippi by the combined armies of Marcus Antonius, aka Mark Antony, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, and Gaius Octavius, Caesar's nephew and adopted son, which is why he took the name Caesar himself, the name by which he goes in this play, and thus not yet a political title, although it will become one soon. From 40 BC on, these three men, Caesar, Antony, and Lepidus, shared power as a triumvirate, dividing the Roman provinces between them, with Caesar controlling Western Europe, Lepidus North Africa, and Antony Greece, Asia Minor, and Egypt. There, despite the fact that he was already married to his third wife Fulvia, and would, after her death, marry Caesar's sister Octavia, Antony began his own passionate, disastrous love affair with Queen Cleopatra. The play chronicles the triumvirate's inevitable collapse, first after quashing the threat posed by Pompey the Great's son, Sextus Pompeius, also confusingly called Pompey, followed by Caesar's turning against Lepidus, and followed, finally, by open hostilities between Caesar and Antony, culminating in the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, from which Cleopatra's navy would inexplicably flee, and Caesar would emerge triumphant. Now, it sounds like I just spoiled the whole plot, but to Shakespeare's audiences, there was hardly any suspense about the outcome. To them, these events were famous. Anyone with a basic education had read about them in school or was familiar with the characters from popular literature and theater. Valiant, headstrong, undisciplined Antony, beautiful, seductive, jealous Cleopatra, stoic, icy, calculating Caesar. Indeed, to some extent, the play relies on our remembering Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, whose Antony is a great deal more charismatic and nimble. There's not much time to develop him here. We meet him as already something of a spent force. It's an older role for an aging leading man, written by a now middle-aged playwright. And Mark Antony is dead before we even reach Act 5. Thereafter, it really becomes Cleopatra's play. But we get the sense that it's been her world all along, insofar as she is the most flamboyantly theatrical character and the one with the deepest theatrical roots, because this is a play that imagines history itself as theater, as a kind of performance in which the protagonists are hopelessly trapped and from which they are powerless to deviate. Antony knows Caesar will win, yet chooses to wage war anyway. He knows Cleopatra will destroy him, yet cannot resist her. Cleopatra knows that one day the quick comedians extemporally will stage us, and some squeaking Cleopatra, boy, my greatness. And the boy actor who would have spoken those lines on stage in 1607 implicitly proves her right. Uncannily aware of themselves as historical figures and tragic types, the lovers struggle to find moments where they are fully present on stage together and not always on the verge of parting, separating. Their relationship works best as a long distance one because it allows each to serve for the other as an idealized object of memory and desire. No sooner do we meet them in Egypt than Antony is called to Rome. No sooner does he leave than Cleopatra begins to fantasize about what he might be doing. Where thinkst thou he is now? Stands he, or sits he? Or does he walk? Or is he on his horse? When we see them clearest, it's always from the outside, mediated by the perceptions of others, in the stories about them that constantly circulate through this play. They waste themselves in luxury, they throw huge parties, they stage pageants in the streets, glorifying and debasing themselves in the common showplace, as the play puts it. Paradoxically, they rarely appear together, yet seem perpetually on public display. And it's worth watching this production for how it deals with the challenge of a text whose central relationship depends so heavily on narrative, on telling rather than showing, which is a distinctly untheatrical mode. The play's most famous speech belongs to neither Antony nor Cleopatra. Enobarbus's long, sumptuous account of the barge she sat in like a burnished throne, the lines will be familiar to you as soon as you start hearing them, purports to recall their very first meeting. Yet if you listen to it closely, you'll notice that Antony is almost entirely absent from it, and to a surprising degree, so is Cleopatra. How do you realize characters who are larger than life? This is sort of the problem of the play. Do you even try? Or do you let them become instead projections of the audience's own imagination, just as they are of each other's? No less than the lead roles, Rome and Egypt themselves form distinct characters in this play. And the visual work of nearly every modern production consists in evoking and differentiating the two. Yet the diametrically opposed stereotypes that define each culture, austere, masculine, militaristic Rome ruled by rigid codes of honor, sensuous, feminine, decadent Egypt, a palace of pure pleasure, turns out to be another binary the play upsets. The only drunken revels we see are Roman ones. Roman alliances are just as fickle and fragile and subject to political expedients. Knowing Antony's strength lies on land, Caesar opts to attack him by water, an element consistently identified with the slime and ooze of Egypt's swollen Nile. There is no stable ground on which to stand in this play, and I would watch for how the National Theatre's use of a revolve, a turnable stage, enhances that dimension. Likewise, the boundaries between comedy and tragedy are fluid here, each making disconcerting appearances in the midst of the other. One minute, Antony is hearing of Fulvia's death. The next, he's making jokes about Cleopatra's orgasms. Cleopatra threatens to beat a messenger for delivering bad news. That's a conventional thing. But then she actually starts doing it in a scene that becomes both cruel and ridiculous. Notoriously, as Antony dies, she calls for his body to be raised up to her, to be hoisted up to a balcony, which is an absurd overcomplication that has vexed and frustrated actors and directors for centuries. How do you do that? How a production handles these ambiguities of decorum and these rapid shifts in tone, whether reverently or irreverently, softening them or heightening them, will be crucial indicators of the interpretation it pursues, as will finally its handling of race and gender. Though the historical Cleopatra was ethnically Greek, heir to a dynasty that had governed Egypt since the age of Alexander the Great, the cultural difference she embodies is insistently racialized and sexualized. She is, we are often told, as much a man as Antony is, and he as much a woman as she is. She is called tawny, sunburnt, and gypsy. The National Theatre's color-conscious and gender-fluid casting, not only Sophie Okonedo in the lead role, but Tunji Kasim as Caesar, and Katie Stevens as his formerly male General Agrippa, seem poised to recognize this and to exploit it, to push it in provocative directions. I'm as excited to watch the show as you are, and I hope this introduction has helped clarify some of the essential relationships and underlying themes of this incredibly rich, complex play. A play that's imperfect in all the ways theater needs Shakespeare to be imperfect in order for his plays to remain new and vital and alive. Enjoy.